3, 2, 1, and we're live. So what are you researching specifically right now? What are you looking into for this PhD?
So first I'll say one of my problems that my supervisor always tells me, he says, Spencer, stop floundering. So I flounder a lot. So I have so many things I'm interested in. So I'm always needing to narrow my focus just specifically for my research. So now, when I did my master's, it was about big data, media, information, surveillance, these sorts of things. But I've really been interested in organizational behavior because that's that sort of relational aspect that I lost a little bit in my MA in terms of research, where I studied more in my undergrad with social psychology. That relational aspect, I'm like, okay, so all these big principles that we're talking about, these big sociological concepts, where can we start to see them at work, and what's relevant for me to study? And organizational behavior for me is really interesting, or organizations more broadly. I'm studying the transformations of work and labor, digital work and labor, and I'm going to be looking at them specifically through after the pandemic. So how is organizational how have organizations reorganized, or what do they look like now after the pandemic? One of the things that we're going to see after this pandemic is the idea of a hybrid working environment, right? So 3 days maybe you're going to be in the office, 3 days you're maybe going to be working from home. There's really no frame of reference for that. There's not. I mean, I'm sure there's researchers out there doing that much farther along than I, but I'm really interested in, okay, so what does that mean for the dynamics of the organization? What does that mean for relationships? What does that mean for community in the organization? How might, so again, you could zoom out, how might this post-COVID reorganization of work and labor impact communities differently? Is there fundamentally different conceptions that we might have about what it means to be a productive worker, where people could be contributing to their communities in different ways that they've realized they might be able to through COVID? So broadly speaking, it's the digital transformations of work and labor through COVID is going to be my dissertation that I'm working towards. And then my substantive areas of study are, work and organizations, the social psychology of self and selfhood, and media and information. Yeah. Those three things. So, in a perfect world, I would, teach classes in those three things. Yeah. But yeah, so that's my research. I don't know if that answers what you want to know.
That definitely answers my question, and I'm also curious because now you're a professor. What was that transition like, and did you always kind of plan on doing, being a professor and offering that? And what has that been like for you to teach other students, to have been a student and now to be sharing that information with others?
It's a dream. I love it. There's one of the things. One of the things I often see with academia and like established academics, whatever that means, is this idea that teaching is less than, like if you're, oh, you're teaching? Do you not have enough funding dollars for your research? Why are you teaching? Like there's this and for me, having the mentors that I had in my undergrad, I'm always like, what are you talking about? Like I'm passionate about these things. I can pace around and rant for 2.5 hours. Like who wouldn't want to do that? So for me, it's been a dream. And I think there's really there's not, maybe it's because I am still a PhD student, but there's really no difference. Well, I guess there is occupationally, but like I think what makes me passionate, or if I am good at my job, what would make me good at my job is that I have a passion for learning. So I always feel like I'm a student. You know what I mean? I'm never talking about things as though I have all of the answers. It's almost like hey, here's some things I'm really interested in. Here's how I look at them. Here's some other ways of looking at them with people who don't look at them the same way I do. What do we think about this? Let's talk. In a nutshell, that's kind of what I try and do. So I talk about topics that I think about, and even if I'm teaching, like an intro class that has a pretty structured, like, there's certain seminal pieces of work that you need to cover, intro, different law classes that you took. Even if there are those things that I have to do, I'm always contextualizing them in issues that I care about. You know, if we want to talk about centralized finance sociologically, I'll, you know, start talking about Bitcoin or something that I'm like thinking about or interested in at the time. And so I think for me, that's what brings such joy to me, and I hope that I convey that in my job, because I just, like I said, I just pace around and rant about things that I care about. And you know, if students are interested and they email me, and there's been students who have you know, cultivated their research interests in my classes, and for me that's the best thing. When you see that you've inspired somebody, or someone has an idea, something that they're thinking about, and you know, you help them cultivate that. You ask them questions, and you get them thinking about it, and they go down this rabbit hole researching this thing and find out like, hey, I really want to explore this further. There's no better feeling to me than that.
That's awesome. I'd like to know what classes you actually teach, and then what is the gist of the topic, because I do know that we have some listeners who haven't gone to university, and so just the term sociology, I'm sure they've heard it, but what are the courses you teach, and what are kind of the basics that you're trying to pull out of them?
So the first class that I teach is Introduction to Sociology, so Soc 101, and we basically, I cover all of the you know, the seminal topics in the field. I look at, what I do is I take each topic. So, you know, 1 week might be deviance, gender and sexuality, um, law, all of these broad topics, and then we look at them through the three main sort of paradigms, which are fundamentally different ways of, you could look at the same social phenomena, but from a, you know, a different theoretical perspective, and the detail that you're looking at is going to be completely different, right? If you're looking at crime from, you know, a critical race theory, it's going to look a lot different than, you know, a functionalist perspective who, you know, so anyways, so 101 is that. So I guess, and between the lines there, my goal for Introduction to Sociology is not to teach a topic, not to tell you what to think, but to it should be like introduction to critical thinking, I think. So different ways of thinking about topics, or what are the questions that we might ask about these topics. So if there's any takeaway from that course, it's how can we start thinking about issues differently, and how can we recognize differences in these perspectives, and what do we make of all this? So that's the goal for that class. I teach a second year class right now that's big data, surveillance, and society. So that's a lot of my own research interests into, you know, we talk about what is big data, what is platform capitalism, what is the attention economy, these sorts of topics. So again, it's thinking about these things with different perspectives. I'll often pick readings where it might be confusing at first until the lecture comes, because there'll be two readings that'll be the same issue, but we're talking like completely different perspectives on them, right? So it's, what's he doing here? So I try and do that a lot, not to confuse anyone, but just to say, like, you know, we can look at these things differently based on what sort of theoretical aim we're taking. I also teach a fourth year class, which is Issues in the Information Society, which is essentially a lot of the same as the second year, but there's more expectations of the students by that point. So whereas in the second year class, I'm really cultivating an orientation towards a research perspective, or finding an area of interest, cultivating those questions. By the fourth year class, I shouldn't say I have an expectation that they have their research carved out, but a lot of them are thinking about the next steps after their degree, whether it's grad school or they're going to go into the workforce. So I think that I take these topics and I cultivate their research to get them thinking about what the next step's going to be. So I guess the fourth year class is similar to the second, but with more of a professional development spin on it. And again, that's something that I learned from my mentors, is like, how do these things translate? I don't just want to come into a classroom, talk about these topics. It's like, what can we actually go do? How can we take this and go change something and go do something great? And then I also teach stats, and well, that's stats. So, and I love stats. So it's quantitative research statistics. So they're not taking, you know, their psych stats where they're punching it into the sharp calculator, but I think they all have to do that. But it's an applied stat, so they're working with the statistical software, and we can take census data, and they can look for relationships, and we explain all the the different concepts of when we're looking at linear regression, logistic regression, all these mathematical concepts. But rather than saying, this is what they do, we can be like, okay, we can take these formulas and just punch them into the computer, and we can really make sense of some of this data. So the stats is really just telling a story with numbers.
Yeah. Okay, so I really want to land on what is sociology in comparison to something like psychology, because as I said, I think that will be valuable for people to understand. And then what pulled you in the direction of sociology, just as a broad field?
That's a tough question. I don't know if I have the answer of what delineates or demarcates the discipline in a succinct way, but I think I find, at least myself included, when I was doing my undergrad, a lot of people think they're interested in psychology, and like they think, oh, like, yeah, I'm really interested in psychology, but the sort of concepts or the things that they're interested in looking at are often more sociological. So I guess I don't know. I to me, someone else might have a completely different answer than me, but to me, psychology seems to be more, especially right now, there's a lot of, there's a burgeoning field of neuroscience. So there's a lot more focus on the neuro, obviously, in psychology, cognition in psychology. So these sorts of things where sociology, or, my interest in like social interaction or symbolic interaction, just straddles that line between sociological, where we're looking at how society operates, what makes society tick, and what are the implications for the individual, versus I think a psychological perspective is more centered on individual level outcomes. It doesn't have to be, but what makes the individual tick in terms of cognitive neuro processes, interactional processes. So there's a lot of overlap, but I think the broad question we'd be looking at with sociology is what makes society tick, and then we can look at what the implications are for the individual, whereas the other. And yeah, that's precisely what drew me to sociology. I think, to be entirely honest, I think sociology is like the Swiss Army knife of the social sciences, because with a major in sociology, there's really, like, the whole point, I think, of the field, at least at the undergraduate level, is being able to understand and contextualize social phenomena within the broader scheme of things, right? So what does that mean? That means understanding how individuals function relationally, and what's the social context that makes that first necessitates that interaction, but also produces the foundations for any function. So, like I said, Swiss Army knife, if you have a sociology degree, like, you should have like a critical understanding of how
Because you're
things
able
work.
to make the implicit explicit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You said it much better than I. Yeah.
Well,
and I'm actually going to steal that.
Okay. Well, I just think that because having a background in criminology, which, as you said, is a subsection of sociology, which if you tell a crim student, they're not going to like hearing that, because we like to think we're our own thing. But definitely what I see is an understanding of, like, what I loved about, I think, criminology the most was environmental crime and crimes of opportunity, because it was where the rubber hit the road in terms of how people actually behave. When you think of something like broken windows theory, which has just been talked about to death by unqualified people, but the idea that you can see an environment and it looks like a good area for crime versus an area that does not seem set up to commit crimes. That idea, and seeing how the community of Chilliwack has kind of been developed, because I look at playgrounds now and I'm like, in this playground, there's nowhere to hide. Like, you can see that the slide is super far away from the other active playground area, so that there is no, if the police show up, they can see everything about the park and every spot on there. And so I've seen that kind of occur.
Interesting.
Benches, I've seen, when you look at like a park bench now, it's no longer just a flat across. Usually there's little stumps in between, so you have spots to sit, so somebody can't lay out across it. And so there's ways of preventing crime without having to talk about it. Another good example is a lot of banks have people at the front entrance students who greet you. And the whole idea behind that is it removes the confidence from somebody who's going in to commit a bank robbery. If the person, when they enter, is overwhelmed with kindness and positivity, it makes it harder to commit the crime that they were planning on committing. And so I've seen, working at Alpine Legal Services, going into banks constantly, seeing that greeter there to kind of discourage crime. And so it's super interesting to see how many people are trying to do that, and how stores have rearranged, like Shoppers Drug Mart, to make it harder to steal from the makeup section, because originally the makeup section was its own little cubicle and it was kind of private, and now it's super out in the open and you have a person standing there who can see where you're looking around. And seeing those changes over time to try and address crime has been very interesting to me, just to see the knowledge from the research finally end up in the practical business. And seeing that movement over has given me a great respect for criminology specifically, just because I get to see those changes and see a lot of great, like, we have a lot of concerns right now around police officers and what's going on with accountability. But I have to say, with the education that a Canadian police officer gets in comparison to the United States is absolutely incomprehensible. And the students that at least I got to interact with and the professors I got to interact with, I have a lot of hope and confidence in local police officers and municipal police officers, because I get to see how they're taught and who they're trained by. And these are people with a sociological understanding, with a psychological understanding, with a humility towards what causes people to commit crimes, what historic backgrounds have contributed to people needing to commit crime. And that gives me a lot of confidence, because there is a connection there that you can miss if you don't get the education, if you don't go and learn more about how the world kind of functions, and making that implicit explicit, and being able to say, this is what people are doing, and we can see that people are robbing banks without this person here, and so when we put that person here, we saw a reduction. The other good example was, if you ever are speeding and you have that speed radar that lets you know if you're doing 60 and it gives you a frowny face, they actually found that the frowny face causes you to slow down more than just telling your speed. So
really?
So just knowing that you're going...
Makes me speed up.
The smiley face or the sad face?
The sad face.
The sad face makes you speed up. Well, you would be an outlier in that research, because overall what they found was that a sad face plays more of a role than just knowing your speed. When you see it, you kind of want to max it out. Where they saw with the sad face, it causes people to slow down, because it's a social reinforcement of, we don't like what you're doing. And so I really enjoy learning about other people's research areas, because it gives you an insight onto what they see, but there's also links between where the university impacts the society. And that's what I think UFV could vocalize more, if I could ask them to, would be to get your professors on the front lines and tell the society what you're doing that so greatly benefits our society and our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if I can just plug the Community Health and Social Innovation Hub, I think that's something that they are doing there particularly well, because that's the whole idea of turning knowledge into action. And that's the mission statement of the hub, turning knowledge into action. Given what we know, how do we go and make a difference in the community? And having researchers from all these different disciplines that come through the hub and bring their work through the hub, it gives students an opportunity to become engaged in community research, right? Students can start to see, have the opportunities in their second and third, even first year, to have research assistantships, right? Like, hey, all these things that I'm learning, I can do something with this, right? So, precisely what you said, getting into the community, getting on the front lines, I think that's really important. And I do think that's an area that UFV needs to continue to put more resources into, because it's really, it's a profound opportunity that institution has to make a difference in the surrounding communities. And so, if you're part of that institution, I feel like you ought to be doing that.
Exactly. I really want to talk about statistics with you, because I think that is another area where everybody kind of goes, I'm in over my head now. I know a lot of, I had to retake my stats course, because I was one of those people who was like, well, I'm never going to be a statistician, so I'm going to do the bare minimum. And the second time I took it, I had much more of a humility towards the topic and a hunger to understand where I had gone wrong the first time, because I think I got like a C and I needed a C+ in order to continue, and so I had to retake it. But I decided to take it a little bit more seriously, and I had a great great professor, I think Professor Ken Lee,
Okay.
who's a statistics professor at UFE and super energetic guy. But can you tell us a little bit about what you see in statistics and just give us an understanding of the basics of statistics? And for the listeners, just bear with me.
Okay. Yeah. So statistics is not scary. It is simply telling a story with numbers. So, I mean, when I did my undergrad, I did all my statistical training in the psych department. So I also took my first stats class twice. I won't name the professor, but less than desirable. So I didn't really have any, like, I had the same thing. I was like, okay, what's the grade that I need for my GPA or whatever? Like, let's just focus on that. But then when I took quantitative research methods, so that was kind of your applied statistics, you only really need to understand how the what the functions of the equations are. What is it? You know, if we wanted to take two groups of people and we wanted to compare, you know, you could do a clinical drug trial, for example, and you know you're dosing group A with placebo and dosing group B with some sort of limitless drug or whatever, right? And you were testing reaction time. What is the average reaction time? And when you actually get into the research or get into quantitative stats, yes, you need to know like the math and all that, but you don't insofar as like, okay, I know what sort of, you know, what test that I need to choose to find the difference between those two things and see if that difference is statistically significant. So I think the whole idea of stats, like I said, is just telling stories with numbers. And I think that, yeah, it's really underrated, and it's something that feels yucky and feels intimidating to students or people that might just want to learn stats. But I think data literacy is something that we should all be paying attention to, because part of the problem is that we don't make these tools accessible enough to everybody. You know, it has to be this, or it needlessly is this esoteric sort of thing where you think of stats and you think of someone drawing on the chalkboard, dust, and you know, like in the underground lecture hall. But I think there's an importance in data literacy, so making these things accessible to everyone and being like, hey, you know, this isn't rocket science really, and you don't necessarily need a background in statistics to go out and find the information that you want to find to infer some sort of
Here's something for you that I have a question about.
Yeah.
Do you think that it's not practiced, or that people don't know that they're doing it when they're doing it? Because like one area that I think of is reviews. When I'm going to buy a product on Amazon and I see that it has 5-star reviews,
Right.
and it's got like 2,000 5-star reviews,
Right.
and 10 1-star reviews.
Right.
I go, okay, this is a good product.
Yeah.
It's good to go.
Yeah.
But you don't think, I'm going to apply my statistics understanding that more participants enjoyed the product than didn't enjoy the product.
Right.
You don't think that when you're doing it, but our whole society has become review driven. If your Netflix tells you it's an 89% match, you're like, I'll check it out, or 100% match, you'll check it out.
Yeah.
If the YouTube video has more likes than dislikes, you're more likely to check it out. If your Amazon product has more positive reviews than negative, you're more likely to check it out. And so we're using our basic understanding of stats unknowingly. We're unaware that that's what we're doing when we're analyzing that.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. Yeah. I would agree, and I suppose. Yeah, that's one way to make the implicit explicit. I think another thing is just I see a lot of websites now that might have dashboards or like stats dashboards where they might explain something, or you know, there's a graphic user interface that makes things a little bit more accessible, because you know, perhaps it's not Amazon products or you know, buying something or watching something on YouTube, but rather, you know, you might hear a piece of news information, right? And this comes back to this whole idea about, you know, fake news and truth and post-truth and all of this, these big terms. But you know, when you hear the numbers, we think, oh yeah, you know, reputable source said something about these numbers, that might be the case. But just, you know, it doesn't take very much learning, or it doesn't. There's not a lot required to just get the information that you need so that you can go look at those numbers and you can sort of find out, well, what's the story with these numbers, because you could have any sort of, you could give a statistician any data set, right, and then tell them, this is the story I need you to tell with these numbers. They'll find a way to tell that story, right? So this idea about data literacy, I think, is really important, especially in what you have just identified as a data-driven culture, right? We're, a review-based culture, and it's, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely experienced that. I have one song quote that just came to mind as you were kind of commenting on that, which is, I was trusting statistics more than I trusted me. And I think that that is one error that people can make when it comes to statistics. And I think that Indigenous culture, again, has this issue, is that we're hearing about the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prisons. We're hearing about the overrepresentation of murdered women, and those are obviously issues, but we're not talking about perhaps what could be the future overrepresentation of brilliant Indigenous people. And like, you can get locked into, if you looked at all the statistics on an Indigenous person living in downtown Chilliwack, you wouldn't think that they would go become a lawyer, podcaster, entrepreneur, these things, because if you look at the statistics, there's no evidence to support that. Exactly. And so statistics, I think, are incredibly valuable to give us information, but there's only so much information they can give before you have to make your own personal decisions, because I think these discussions of crime and who's committing it and who's overrepresented in what populations can become a narrative in and of itself.
Of course,
that's very discouraging, and that's my main concern with this focus on the crimes against Indigenous people and the historic horrible atrocities that have happened, is that it's not a narrative that young Indigenous people can go, okay, well, watch me go become the best CEO, the best politician, the nicest person, the best leader, these ideas aren't within the statistics, because we're looking at where the problems are. And I think that that's where statistics can be a tool, but it can be a bias tool, in that what you're looking, kind of like what you said, what you're looking for can be found as long as that's what you're looking for. And it can not yield other results that are just as relevant.
So it reproduces the systemic inequalities that it first identifies.
Exactly.
Yeah. Definitely a problem. And perhaps that's again an area where, speaking sociologically, we need to, again, contextualize the data. If we're talking about statistics, or we're talking about, the overrepresentation of a given population in any domain, the conversation can't just end there. That's the thing. Yeah. So I think that's the whole community aspect that you're really bringing here, and that you do really well, is we could talk about these things, but we're not talking about people as a number. The conversation doesn't end there. So it's, given this, how do we change that? How do we pivot on this? How do we shift towards inspiration? So those are some of the things that I think I aspire to do in life. I don't have the answers, but